what do you think is the most relevant thing that has been happening now in schools? How do you see what you're doing now in UPenn? In what direction is it moving? Is it moving forward to where you want it? Does it take a lot of time because you came in a certain moment, or where's the future? What's the future practice? Where are we heading? No?
The way I set up education was involving very advanced companies in being our client or being our sponsor or being our partner, and doing projects with these people, and but also, you know, do the financing, make sure it's relevant on urban and architectural level, and having a real feedback mechanism automatically built in, is to understand that not only how do we make education so the kids are ready for a whole other role of architect, which I feel is really massively changing, but also like how do we incorporate other businesses in education to kind of get a real-time feedback from the real world all the time, and having real projects and real investigations going on. Because I think the fact that academics sometimes is so cut off from reality is not productive, and I think to me it's also more, I believe in integral rather than integrate.
I mean, we've also had these conversations about that design not only starts when you're designing a building, but design starts with the negotiations, with the politics, with a lot of different things that maybe they were not taught in school at first.
I could not imagine having my practice without teaching. I've always been teaching, as you said. And to force myself to constantly have a long-term view, instead of like, you know, zooming in on this problem we have to solve, and it's obviously always an interesting problem and I think should be solved. And I think that is kind of my motto, sort of, like, you know, rather than thinking that you have to solve all the little stuff and get obsessed about it, look at the big picture, create some interesting thing to do. Yeah. Really, I'm against master plans. I believe in organic, really fast impulses, and and then seeing how that reacts and how it happens, and then adjusting it.
Before crowdsourcing and all these things that were now because of the social media, I remember, I forgot the name of the guys doing it, but they were trying to do a store in some part of the city where they put a sign in the window saying, what do you want this to be? But as you said, who brings it down and does it? And you test it, no?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's also when your experience comes in, you know, people want a lot of things, but they can only tell you what they want. It needs translation, and it needs kind of maybe a bigger sweep, you know, like some things were like really tiny, but they could be really important for an area.
And talking again about education, when you're doing that with your students and they're seeing this also is designing, no? You're designing the dialogues, you're designing possibilities for dialogues, you're designing, synthesizing all that information into something.
Yeah, I always hope that something generates something else, you know, that there is some sort of dynamics created by it. But I like what you said about the change of design, and that it's not like, oh, we do, you know, we do research and then we stop and then we design. No. The research part is already the design part, and when we're designing, we're still bringing in more research. So the idea is really that you're constantly, like, to my students I say, is like, imagine you're a private detective and you're solving a case. You're not going to stop looking at evidence. You need to constantly, like, bring in more evidence and more, you know, smart arguments of why this solution is the best one.
It doesn't finish when the building is built. What happens because the architecture exists?
Herbert Michel, who was the critic of the New York Times at that point, he looked at the project and he said, so you think that extension is a parasite? I said, no, absolutely not. It's just extension. And our extension was twice the size of the original building, or still filed it as an extension. Had certain benefits. But what he said, so you have essentially started a new type called the para building. And so he wrote like a huge article in the New York Times, para building, blah, blah, blah. And then, funny enough, what you started seeing in New York was all these buildings with extensions bigger than the original building popping up everywhere. What is really interesting of architecture and cultural critics is that they can really push things in ways we could never do, because you could never read your own building like that. We had this conversation that he suddenly thought, so there is a para building, which means it's a new type, and what does that mean? And so he started writing about the urban effects and the architectural effects and the potential of continuity in the urban language while still bringing in new architectural forms. No?
And how does it really change the way conventional or common things were seen, no? That we can advance them a little bit, no?
No, exactly, and these are the interesting things I think we need to do, because I think the shift between urban and privacy is exactly where it happens. No, our cities we can really change by taking the conventional and making it unconventional, rather than thinking that everything has to be special. I think it is the most interesting to look at the most conventional,
the
and to really understand and criticize and rethink and figure out like what can we do here so that we shift all boundaries.
Yeah.
The small shifts are the most interesting ones.
Just maybe to round up, it's that if somebody has something important to say, if somebody has an opinion, design starts even from the sidewalk.
The biggest thing I learned from looking at Colombia was that they changed whole neighborhoods by either putting a library or a school in the middle, and that became their public event space, their public plaza, the place people started together, have a beer. But what was even more interesting is that the city didn't just do that, but then from there on they started putting the most beautiful pavement in patterns all throughout the neighborhood. So where these slums essentially, first were on mud roads and the sewage was blocked up and all that stuff, now suddenly what was already their public living room, because it's hot and they're living outside a lot, became the most beautiful. And what was people's reaction? They were starting to fix the houses. And I thought that was just the most poetic and beautiful thing I've seen in a long time.
But that again is what happened because the architecture, because what was after the architecture. And to me, the most important thing is the sense of pride.
Yeah.
You started seeing in all the people a sense of,
yeah.
They were proud about.